Heaven Burns Red is honestly way better than it has any right to be. It's a visual novel that has production values on par with any of the big VNs out there, and best of all, it's free to play. At the same time, it's probably a game that is trapped rather than enhanced by the fact that it's a gacha game. It's also Japanese only as of half a year since its release, although it just got a Steam port, which is what I'll be showing off here. Heaven Burns Red is first and foremost a visual novel, and it's to such an extent that I'm confused as to why they even bothered making it an online gacha game as opposed to just a visual novel JRPG. Setting aside the obvious reason of how gacha games tend to make more money than normal games due to how much easier it is to create content that players can constantly pay for as opposed to a one-time payment. This is the only gacha game that I've ever played that doesn't have any sort of player interaction. No PvP, no competing for high scores, no guilds, heck, not even a friends list. What it does have instead is amazing voice acting, tons of CGs, and an absolute butt ton of vocal songs from Yanagi Nagi, Konomi Suzuki, and Dai. It's the only gacha game I know where every time there's a new event, they're like, well, I guess we can get another vocal song done for it, I guess. It's got an engrossing story that constantly tosses curveballs at you, and it's definitely a Jun Maide plot in every sense of the word, the good and the bad. My feelings on Heaven Burns Red are complicated. Had I made this overview after playing the first chapter, I would have given Heaven Burns Red the biggest, fattest, shining, glowing review. Had I done so after the second chapter, I would have been much more cautiously optimistic. Finally, after having reached past the third chapter and hitting the barrier to progress, I think I have a good enough grasp of Heaven Burns Red in its entirety, of the gameplay that looks flashy, plays alright, and of how the gacha elements eventually lead into a roadblock for the player. Heaven Burns Red has a lot going for it. It looks fantastic, the production values of the story are insane. At the same time, its comedy can kind of verge on inane, and I want to go over all of that as we dive into Heaven Burns Red. Before we do anything though, as always, let's run through what this game is all about. Heaven Burns Red follows the story of Kayamori Ruka, the team leader of 31A, one of the many female-only military units that are tasked with the mission of being humanity's last line of defense against invaders known only as Cancer, an otherworldly entity which has destroyed the majority of Earth's population. In order to combat these monsters, they wield the mysterious power Seraph. In total, the cast is composed of all the different military units: 31A, 31B, 31C, 31D, 31E, 31F, and 31X, with each team having 6 members alongside the 3 commanding officers. With all that said, the focus is always on the main characters and their interactions with one of the different groups. As the team members of 31A are the ones we'll be hanging out with for the entirety of the game, let's focus on them. The members of 31A are the protagonist, Kayamori Ruka, an exceedingly eccentric girl who also used to be the lead vocalist for the legendary rock band called She Is Legend. Izumi Yuki, a genius hacker who was a part of the international hacker group known as Orchid, that apparently helped stop World War III or something. Tojo Tsukasa, a self-proclaimed intelligence officer who in actuality is absolutely useless at her job, and only seems to remember random trivia. Asakura Karen, a completely normal school girl who's great at FPS games, and has a split personality of an insane murderer known as Karin-chan. Aikawa Megumi, a self-proclaimed savior of the world from Kansai, who has psychic powers that never seem to actually be useful when it comes to fighting. And finally, Kunimi Tama, a former captain of a battleship that ended up being the only ship to remain after a huge battle. What should be pretty clear after what I've said about each one of them is that the cast is super quirky. They all have something special about each one of them, and they're all larger than life. The star of the show is, as you might imagine, the main character Kayamori Ruka. The easiest way I can describe her is that, think of someone who is trying her best to mess around with every single other person, and that's Ruka in a nutshell. She's constantly poking fun at everything and everyone, including her superior officers. There is a response system in the game, all of which is completely voiced, and about half the answers paint Ruka as this absolutely insane individual with no regards to authority. She acts as the idiot for everyone to go, "What on earth are you doing?" On the other hand, her incredible friendliness enables her to get along with all the other teams, and she has a tendency to give everyone pet names. The cast as a whole is incredibly expressive. Like, the voice actors are screaming their hearts out for these lines. Acting is really good for the most part, with every character being incredibly distinctive from one another, which is fairly impressive given how enormous the cast is. Megumi's Kansai accent is rock solid. Karirin's split murderer personality, Karin-chan, is probably my favorite voice actor in this game, hands down. With that said, I think each of the main characters are a bit too reliant on their unique little verbal gags. Having a general character archetype is totally fine. It's just when everyone repeats infinite variations of the exact same dumb joke, it goes from charming to eventually a little grating. There are so many examples of this for every single character. For instance, the newest event stars Shirakawa Yuina and Kiryu Miwa. In this event alone, which roughly took an hour and 30 minutes to finish, we run through this joke where Yuina says something kinda questionable. Miwa retorts, as in trying to say, no, you're not crazy. Yuina points out that Miwa is still wearing her mask, literally and metaphorically. Miwa takes it off and tries to answer seriously. And they do this bit at least more than 8 times, sometimes even back to back. Like, yeah, it might be funny the first time, but by the 8th time, I'm kind of over it. It reaches a point where I feel like they're just beating a dead horse, and the main characters especially have so many of these sort of things, which I think it's supposed to be charming. The game loves this whole repeated gag humor, and here's the worst example that I can think of when it comes to a single scene, which is like 2 to 3 minutes long. The scene starts with Megumi trying to self-meditate in order to unlock her psychic powers. Then when Ruka joins her and tries to do the same, this prompts Megumi to go, you know, it's fine, right? Like, it's a cute scene. Hey, stop that, you're already a legendary rocker, stop trying to take my cool psychic character as well. And then they proceed to repeat this gag 4 more times in this scene. The voice acting is really good, but I don't find the repeated gag part that funny. The conversation verges so hard into absolute nonsense that my brain just stops caring about what's being said. Don't get me wrong, it's a lot of fun watching these voice actors really get into playing each one of their roles. It's just the whole Manzai act, you know, with one character playing the straight man or Tsukomi, to the funny man or Bokeh, is a tad bit overdone and the game never really knows when to stop. Switching gears for a sec, let's talk about the production values for Heaven Burns Red because it's kind of insane. Contributing to the whole feel of the game, aside from the 3D walking animations and the extremely solid voice acting, there's also a ridiculous plethora of music made for Heaven Burns Red as well. Now, I have no idea what is with Jun Maide's fascination with making his main characters be part of a music band, but somehow that's a big part of Heaven Burns Red as well, where our main characters in their downtime between missions take part in a band that is essentially a revival of the legendary rock band that Luca used to be a part of called She Is Legend. Due to this, Heaven Burns Red has so many vocal songs, like an ungodly number of them, that I don't even see in most visual novels. Nearly every song in the game that plays during the chapter has a vocal version of it in the game that will play during important moments. Currently, I think there are at least 15 vocal songs in this game, which is absolutely insane. The majority of the songs are done by Yanagi Nagi, however, the songs sung by the actual main characters have Konomi Suzuki as the lead singer with Zai as a backup one. Konomi Suzuki is of course famous for doing so many anime openings, No Game No Life's opening, and ReZero among others. It's shocking just how many vocal songs are in Heaven Burns Red, not just for a gacha game, but even for a visual novel, that's an impressive number. Granted, you have to actually kinda like Yanagi Nagi's music, but it's tough to really hate on very poppy J-rock in my opinion. The vocal songs go a long way in punctuating all the key moments of every chapter and all the big events that happen in the game. Speaking of which, because this is a Jun Maide game, of course there's a lot of big feels in Heaven Burns Red, as expected of any sort of story with his writing in it. If the name Jun Maide doesn't ring any bells, he's basically the main scenario writer and music composer for most things Key has done. You know, Canon, Air, Clannad, Little Busters, Angel Beats, all of that. He's not the only writer, but he is the main one. And Heaven Burns Red is no different. His classic formula of slice of life juxtaposed against big sad crying moments is here as well. Now, I will say that I think it's here where I find some issues with not just Jun Maide, but Heaven Burns Red specifically, and that's mostly down to pacing. The sad moments definitely still happen here. Each chapter usually has one extremely pivotal one that is razor focused on trying to get you to empathize with the troubles of each character. That said, I think Heaven Burns Red doesn't handle the transition between the fun slice of life portion and a cry your heart out Nakige portion really well at times. I talked about how the story is this relentless manzai barrage where characters are constantly making jokes about absolutely everything, so when a super heartfelt moment actually happens, it feels kind of like a mood whiplash. On one hand, you can say that it makes the sad moments all that much more prominent when compared back to back with the big feels. On the other hand, I think the jump between the two is so rushed that it kind of devalues the other. It's not like the moment is entirely out of nowhere, there is some setup which the game points out, but, well, you'll see what I mean. Chapter 1 has the most egregious example of this. Chapter 2 and 3 do handle their whole conflict resolution quite a bit better, as there is more time dedicated to fleshing out the characters, but chapter 1, it's something. In fact, I'm gonna spoil it here because I want you to really understand what I mean, especially since, unlike everything that happens afterwards, chapter 1's entire story arc is so unimportant to the overall story that no one really bothers to talk about it again after it happens. That said, if you would like to see it yourself, feel free to skip ahead using the chapter link. You should see a timestamp for this section. So, Chapter 1's big conflict is that, halfway through after all the introductions, the team leader of Squad 31C, Yamawaki Bone Ivar, nicknamed Waki, challenges Ruka, the captain of Squad 31A, in order to take their number, as the A designation has always been for the most elite out of that year's squads. The most important member of Squad 31C, aside from their leader, is Bungo Yayoi, the self-proclaimed servant of the mad scientist and little annoying gremlin who is constantly following Waki's misadventures. They constantly butt heads throughout the latter half of chapter 1, which eventually culminates in the final battle when Ruka decides to abandon her competition in favor of protecting the dome, which is where all the civilians live. After the whole battle, Mari, one of Waki's team members, finally reveals why Waki is trying so hard to become number 1, and it's because of Yayoi's condition. Essentially, Yayoi has anterograde amnesia, where she can't form any new memories. As for how far back she's had this problem, the answer is since they were children when she got attacked by a cancer. This is why Waki still pretends to be a mad scientist all this time, even now that they're adults, as every time Yayoi wakes up, she only remembers a time back when they were playing make-believe. Yuki points this out going, "Oh, that makes sense. That's why for the past several days since the competition, she feels like they've been repeating the same interaction over multiple days," which I would like to point out that I couldn't even tell that's what they were going for, because every character does all of these repeated gags over and over, and I didn't notice that this one was meant to be a secret hint towards something else. Anyways, that's why this entire time Waki has been keeping up this over-the-top mad scientist persona, and the reason why she tried to become the best, so that she could reach a position where she can fight stronger cancer and enlist the help of more renowned researchers who can maybe one day fix Yayoi's memory. Yes, it's sad, and Waki spending every morning crying about the circumstances will probably bring a tear to your eye. But it's undercut by the fact that all the characters were definitely joking around not just 7 minutes ago, and the relentless barrage of stupid gags completely covers what is meant to be a super big reveal of a moment. We also pretty much completely forget about both Waki and Yayoi after this chapter, which feels a little disappointing considering how important they made them feel. Honestly, the later chapters do a much better job, although again, the core complaints I have of the overuse of gags and trying too hard to be insanely sad near the very end kinda remains. It at least feels more earned considering we get much more build up towards each conclusion in later chapters though. The second big problem I see with the story of Heaven Burns Red is less of a mood whiplash sort of situation and more of a general flow due to how it is structured. Basically, how the story goes after the first chapter is that each chapter, there are 1 or 2 main missions which all the squads present in the Seraph army are tasked with completing. Up until that mission, all the time is spent on the main characters doing VR missions to practice for the actual mission, which is the concluding battle for the chapter. What ends up happening due to this formula is that a lot of nothing happens for the good majority of the time. The parts that the player wants to see is the slice of life stuff, where the main characters and the other squad members form new relationships and bonds. While you do get to see that half the time, the other half is just training, and what happens during training feels like a whole lot of nothing usually. The main characters run through a portion of a dungeon which they'll have to run through eventually again, fighting through enemies that they gotta fight again at the end of the chapter. All the while, everyone's just complaining about how tough it is or how fast they have to do the mission. It feels like a whole lot of wasted time more than anything, and I find nearly all of the training portions pretty dang boring to read through. The slice of life in the game is really well done, the voice acting is great, but man is the training these characters have to do so incredibly monotonous. When the game does focus on the growing relationship of Ruka to, say, another squad leader or another squad member, that is when the story tends to shine. Speaking of training, let's finally get to the gameplay. When I first saw the gameplay to Heaven Burns Red, I was very impressed by it. It definitely looked like if I had tried to run this game on my phone would explode. The graphics are very nice, the fact that characters hang around all over this hub area, and they even change positions and have unique dialogue depending on the day, or even during dungeons, you can see them run through a 3D environment, is all very impressive. The battles have very fluid animations with big enemies. Where the crack starts showing is when you notice the little things, like how most characters share animations with many other characters, like all scythe attackers share the same AoE animations when they use a skill. Same with the sword users, gun users, and so forth. Most characters only have unique animations for their SSR form supers. A lot of the game, especially early on, is based on just doing repeated AFK farming, although to be fair, at least the game makes doing so really easy, as there are systems in place where you don't have to keep your app running while the battles keep on going. As for battles themselves, they are a pretty basic turn-based affair where characters get SP every turn, and by utilizing that SP, they can activate their abilities. Everyone has a shield bar and an HP bar, with the shield bar basically acting as your actual HP, as HP only comes into play once your shield breaks. When your shield breaks, a character is usually like one hit away from dying, so they're pretty much as good as dead. If anyone ever actually dies, it's an instant game over regardless of how many members are still alive. It's not really bad gameplay per se, but it does get a bit monotonous, as most battles tend to devolve into spam AoEs until the enemy dies. Luckily, there is an auto battle which unlocks after the first few chapters. Boss battles are actually quite a bit of fun, as they usually have whole sequences in different forms. The developers clearly put a lot of effort into them, going as far as to incorporate them into the actual story with full-on cutscenes and vocal musics to highlight these moments. But they're also pretty few and far in between. Most of the normal battles feel like they're just there to act as a barrier to progression. What I do find kind of annoying though is that there is a clear separation of power between SSR gacha units and every other rarity, with them being the only ones to have supers, which are insanely useful for clearing the content in the game. While there are free characters you can get during events, they aren't the greatest. They aren't entirely useless due to how characters work in Heaven Burns Red. You're allowed to mix and match all the different skills between each version of a character. That said, it doesn't change the fact that you really want a pretty varied team of SSR units for bosses with different weaknesses. To make things worse, the SSR rates, which is the highest rarity, isn't the greatest, and the daily amount of gacha currency you get means that it'll be a long time before you can save up for a pity row. Harder content wouldn't be a problem if it was just there for a challenge, except that the main story content is also gated by battles, and the story bosses are actually really tough. As the story is the main reason you want to play Heaven Burns Red, it's kind of rough when you don't get to see all of it due to not having a strong enough team. My recommendation is that if you do want to play Heaven Burns Red, is to look up a tier list like say the one on Game 8 JP and try to reroll your first guaranteed SSR until you get a tier 1 attacker or blaster. It's a lot easier to sub in S-rank support units, of which you have plenty of, but having supers on your main SSR damage dealers is insanely important to clearing the content. If you can, I'd even try to roll for an additional SSR with your 2 free tempos afterwards. Heaven Burns Red makes rerolling a very streamlined experience, since if you delete your account on the title screen, you can skip most of the prologue and go straight to your SSR free roll. I greatly dislike rerolling, and even I found the reroll experience to be super fast. I could go from deleting my account to getting the free SSR and 2 tempos within 3 minutes. Personally, I just stuck with whatever the game gave me, but I did try out the reroll experience just to understand how it worked. It's fast enough that you lose nothing by at least guaranteeing your first SSR to be a great damage dealer, and maybe even getting an additional one with the free pose. As a heads up, I might as well quickly explain the different rows each character can be categorized as, so words like blaster and attacker mean anything to you. Basically, there are 7 rows in Heaven Burns Red. 3 of them are damage dealers, Blaster is focused on HP damage, Breaker is focused on shield or DP damage, and Attacker is split between the two. After the damage dealers are support rows, which are all pretty self-explanatory. Healers heal, buffers buff, debuffers debuff enemies, and defenders reduce damage taken by allies. All rows don't necessarily do only one thing. For instance, there are debuffers that have great AoE damage, defenders with great buffs, and so on. That said, the most important is easily having some good attackers or blasters, as those are irreplaceable. As critical as I am of Heaven Burns Red, it doesn't change the fact that it's probably one of the best visual novels I played that so happens to be a gacha game. Honestly, if you love Key Studio stuff like Angel Beats and Claned, you'll probably have a good time with Heaven Burns Red. Granted, there is a language barrier to entry considering it's only in Japanese, but if you can read it, then it's incredibly easy to access considering it's free to play on Steam. Yes, I nitpick it a lot in this overview of it, but that's only because I think there is so much to like about it. I honestly do think that had this just been a full-fledged RPG without the gacha elements, I probably would have preferred it that way, since I think the gacha elements do end up leading to a barrier to entry for those who just want to see the story. Voice acting is fantastic all across the board, and there are a ton of music videos throughout the game as well. The characters are actually really funny when they aren't being too obnoxious. Despite all the super long and boring training sessions, I still teared up a little seeing the finales of chapter 2 and 3. Also, I guess if you are interested in playing the game, as I am recommending you to give Heaven Burns Red a shot, I'll leave my invite code on screen and in the description box, as it's something you might as well put in if you plan on playing. It gets you 1000 free gems, which is 1/3 of a tenpo, and it gets me some gems if you actually play further into the game. I'll probably do a whole video covering all the story elements up until chapter 4, just for people who want to hear my thoughts on the story, or for those of you who can't understand Japanese but still want to know what Heaven Burns Red is all about. For those of you interested in that, make sure to hit the notification bell to find out when that's coming out, which should be pretty soon, but you know how it is with me. Stuff happens. If you have anything you want to say about Heaven Burns Red, feel free to leave your thoughts about it in the comments below, and that'll be it for this one. I'll see you later. Till next time.